In my particular fashion, I went and got some unistrut and some scrap metal, and we built this fence stop. If you'd like to see how I done that, you're gonna have to subscribe to my channel, because we will be building one for the house in the next couple weeks. Welcome back to Bowers Creations. I hope everybody's doing all right. And you may have already guessed, in this video, we're gonna build our miter saw fence. All right, to catch everybody up to speed, for those who don't know, what this is called is unistrut. It's used in commercial and industrial applications. And what it's used for is tradesmen such as HVAC guys, electricians, plumbers. They could build metal racks using this unistrut and a various assortment of fittings and other things made for this unistrut to support their conduit, plumbing pipes, whatever. And it eliminates the welder, basically. Sorry for you welders out there taking your work. But that's what this unistrut is. You can get it in very different sizes. This is 7/8 by 1 5/8. Standard unistruts 1 5/8 by 1 5/8. And you can get it with or without holes. For this application, we're going to drill all of our own holes. So if you can find it without holes, that's actually better. Probably more expensive. And this is the most expensive part of this build. This is about $28 for a stick at Home Depot. So if you're like me, I don't have a full 10 foot to my saw. I have about 8'6", 8'7" to my saw. And with the unistrut being 10 foot long, that allows me to cut me a little sample piece. And I suggest you do the same if you can. If you're wanting a full 10 foot, obviously you're not going to be able to do that. But having this sample piece will make it a lot easier to build this assembly. Using our sample piece of unistrut, I cut me a board just a little bit wider than the base of the unistrut. This happens to be 7/8. I wouldn't use anything thinner than about 5/8. And I'll show you later in the video where that thickness will matter, and you can make accommodations for whatever thickness material you used. What you want to do is screw your unistrut to your board and use you a dime as a filler gauge, and set that dime to where it's flush right on the edge of that board. And that will finish our jig to build our assembly. So if you have a piece of 1.5" flat strap, you're already ahead of the game. I didn't have any, so I cut mine out of a piece of plate. Anything at 1/8 inch or thicker will work. This is 3/16. And what I did is I cleaned it up on the grinder until it will freely slide up and down this unistrut. This piece is already 3 3/4 long, so that's what I'm going to go with. The last ones I built to 3 inches, so that measurement really ain't that important. Next thing we need to do is draw an X from corner to corner, find dead center, and punch us a 5/16 hole. Okay, quick disclaimer here. I told you to drill a 5/16 hole in your piece of flat strap, and that was so we could use a 5/16 bolt. Now, depending on how thick your piece of strap is, what I'm noticing is a lot of interference with that bolt head. How I solved that last time is I shaved down this head real thin, and that way that allowed me a little bit more clearance. If you have a tap and die set, let's go ahead and tap this hole to 5/16. And I'll show you a different way of doing that, and we could clearance all this off. So if you was able to tap your hole instead of just drilling it out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run my stud in backwards with the jam nut. I left it recessed just a little bit because I'm going to put a tack weld on it when the time comes. This happens to be just a long carriage bolt. Use whatever you got, and we'll cut it to length when the time comes. We got a slide built, and we got a bolt ran through it. It's working real well. Now we're ready to start the top half of the assembly. But first, there's several measurements we need to take, and there's a few things we need to look at. The first thing, we talked about setting this gap using a dime. The side that board's sticking out, we need to mark as a face. This is what we're going to build off of. This is the important side of this jig. Another thing I want to look at is I told you I was going to weld this stud in so I could keep this nice and flush on the bottom, but I don't like that idea no more. If this stud ever strips out or you need to replace it, it'd be a pain in the butt. Considering we did tap our plate and we're using a jam nut, that would probably hold up for the life of this system here. It's just a home unit. However, I came up with another idea that I think will be a lot better. I found these in the lawnmower section at Home Depot. Here's a part number. These are 5/16 knobs. It doesn't say anywhere on the package, but they are 5/16. It doesn't really matter what size knobs you get. as long as your stud and your knobs match. I opened up my knobs and I realized the studs that come with those knobs are going to be long enough to work for this. I also realized with this shank, what that's going to allow us to do is screw it up until that shank bottoms out. We're going to go ahead and run a jam nut up on it. That's going to make it super strong. That stud's not going anywhere. We could cut the back of this off. That'll allow it to be flush like we want and smooth. But this stud will still be replaceable if we need to pull it out. This is what it should look like after you get your stud cut off, cleaned up. So let's start looking at this top assembly now. The first time I used a little bit bigger angle iron than this. This angle iron is not big enough. It's not going to drop down low enough to give us what we want. But for example, I used a piece of flat strap and the angle iron. I welded up this seam. That made us a little carriage that would slide up and down this rail. What I think I'm going to use instead this time is a piece of square tubing. This is just a scrap piece. I've used it for other projects. We could set that just like that, and that will build our L bracket, and that'll work out perfect. I cut a piece of our square tubing down to the same length as our slide. 3 3/4 is what I made mine. Now when we set this on here, you'll start to see where the thickness of this wood comes into play. You're going to want an 1/8 inch of clearance from the bottom of the wood to the bottom of your slide here. Make sure you hold it down in place where it goes. For mine, all my lumber starts at 7/8. I think I want to plane my wood down to 3/4. That's what this bottom line represents. So this top line is where I want to cut my plate off to have the clearance I need. On the top, it's a lot easier. Let me turn the camera. Again, holding it in place, I'm just going to cut this bracket off right past this other side of the unit strut. That way it'll still slide right down the strut. I got our bracket cleaned up, sized up, ready to go. We'll set it on there. Now there's 2 more things we need to do. The first thing we need to do is clearance out some metal because we're going to put an adjustment screw on here. All this is a 3/8 rod coupling, a 3/8 nut we're using as a jam nut, and a 3/8 bolt. Make sure your bolt's long enough that you got plenty of adjustment. So we need to make sure we flush our bolt up to the front of our jig and then mark it right here at the end of the coupling. And I think for the height, I'm going to mark it right at the top of this wood here, and then we'll clearance all that out. Okay, this is one of the most important steps. I don't know how well you can see that, but what I did is I clamped my bracket to where it's seated nicely on the wooden fence and flat on the rail. And then I took my centerpiece with my stud and I marked the center of that stud. Now this is very important when you pull this slide out of here to move it to the other side. To mark this side, don't spin this around. Make sure it's facing the same way. If that stud is not centered and you spin that around and mark it, it's going to cause you a lot of problems. So now all we need to do is draw a line across there, find center. I'm going to drill a 5/16 hole that our stud will go through. I might even go a 32nd bigger, and then that'll pretty much finish out this bracket. Alright, let's see how accurate our hole is. That drops on there perfect. We'll try our knob out. It's a really long-winded knob. That's not going anywhere. I think that's going to work out perfect. The last thing we need to do is weld on our rod coupling that has our adjustment screw. I'm going to weld that on flush with the bottom of our assembly, and then I'll show you what it looks like, and then we'll get it painted up. Here's our final product. Don't make fun of my welds. I am not a welder. But now I think we can get that ready for paint. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get me a sacrificial bolt. Another 3/8 bolt. And I'm going to screw this in here so that I don't get paint in my threads. And then on this piece, I think I'll just tape it off. And that should protect our threads. I'll shoot it with a few light coats of some etching primer. Probably another coat of some regular primer. And then we'll paint it a bright red and we'll see what it looks like after that. With this self-etching primer, you're supposed to do very light dustings. Several coats of just barely dusting it. For me, it don't matter if I use self-etching primer or if I use straight paint or primer and paint. It always falls off anyway, so we'll let that dry. We'll put another coat on here in a minute. So here's our assembly, all painted up, ready to go. Now we just need to build a fence and we'll have this project done. Unfortunately, I don't have my unistrut yet. If you notice, my countertop's trashed. So this is going to be a two-part video. In the second part, I'll show you how I mount my fence and how I get it all squared up. The final touches involved in that. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it gave you some good ideas, and we'll catch you next time.